"Congresswoman Crockett, you are disrespecting tradition." The words fell like a gavel slammed against stone. Clarence Thomas, cloaked in the quiet weight of decades on the bench, delivered the accusation not with fire, but with an icy calm. The kind of calm meant to cut deeper than rage ever could. For a moment, the chamber froze. It wasn't just a rebuke, it was a declaration. He wasn't merely challenging a point of order, he was questioning her right to stand, her right to speak, her right to belong. The pause that followed was almost unbearable. Eyes darted across the room, searching for reactions. Some lips curled in smug approval, others pressed tightly in shock. Tradition. The word echoed like a weapon, sharpened over generations. Tradition had been used to silence, to exclude, to define who was deemed worthy of power and who was not. And here it was again, hurled across the chamber like a verdict, aimed squarely at a young black congresswoman whose very presence represented change. Jasmine Crockett didn't move at first. She didn't flinch, didn't fire back. She simply held his gaze. To some, that silence seemed like hesitation. To others, it was the calm before an inevitable storm. Her hands rested firmly on the table, but her eyes burned with a defiance that no tradition could cage. The tension thickened, pressing against the walls of the chamber. You could almost hear the collective breath being held. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every twitch, every flicker of emotion. Commentators waiting at their desks leaned forward. Viewers at home shifted in their seats. Something was about to break. Thomas, unbothered by the unease, leaned back ever so slightly as if to signal that the matter was settled. His words had been spoken. His authority in his mind was unquestionable. The silence that followed was meant to seal his dominance, to remind everyone of the hierarchy. Him at the summit, Crockett expected to bow beneath. But then a faint smile curved at the corner of Crockett's lips. Not a grin of amusement, but a smile that carried the weight of battles fought and lessons learned. She was not a newcomer to disrespect. She was not unfamiliar with men cloaking condescension in the language of tradition. The room braced for what would follow because everyone sensed it. Jasmine Crockett was about to respond, and what she did next would silence the chamber and ignite a firestorm across America. Tradition. A word that can comfort or constrain, depending on who wields it. In that chamber, when Clarence Thomas accused Jasmine Crockett of disrespecting it, the air was charged with more than personal disagreement. It was a clash of generations, of values, of visions for what America should be. To Thomas, tradition had long been a shield. It was the language of authority, the rationale for hierarchy, the justification for preserving power in the hands of those who had always held it. From his seat on the Supreme Court, he had spent decades defending institutions, guarding precedents that often reinforced the status quo. He spoke of tradition as if it were sacred, immutable, above scrutiny. But to Crockett and to millions watching, that same word carried a darker echo. Tradition had been the barrier to voting rights, the excuse for segregation, the justification for pay gaps and glass ceilings. Tradition was what had told women and minorities to wait their turn, to accept less, to defer to voices that looked and sounded nothing like theirs. That was what made this confrontation so electrifying. It was not simply a judge scolding a congresswoman. It was the embodiment of two Americas colliding in real time. One clinging to the authority of the past, the other demanding a future not bound by its chains. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Here stood Clarence Thomas, one of the most powerful black men in the country, wielding the word tradition like a sword. And across from him, Jasmine Crockett, younger, fiery, unapologetic, represented a generation unwilling to bow to that sword. It wasn't just about race. It was about whose definition of progress would prevail, whose understanding of dignity would lead America forward. For many watching, Crockett's silence in that moment said everything. She wasn't cowed. She wasn't beaten. She was calculating. And in that calculation lay a story much larger than herself, the story of what it means to be dismissed, underestimated, and then to rise, not in anger, but in clarity and strength. Across social media, the clips of Thomas's accusations spread instantly. Some saw his words as a defense of order. Others saw them as a desperate attempt to hold back the tide of change. Comment threads erupted. Who gets to define tradition? Whose history are we honoring? And whose voices are we silencing? The confrontation tapped into a wound America has never fully healed. Every generation inherits a struggle between reverence for the past and the demand for a better tomorrow. But rarely is that struggle distilled so starkly into one moment, one sentence, one accusation, and so the chamber sat on edge, America on edge with it. Because everyone knew that what Crockett chose to say next would not just be about her. It would be about everyone who had ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to respect a tradition that had never respected them. Clarence Thomas believed he had drawn a line in the sand. He had invoked tradition to remind Crockett of her place, but Crockett was not about to accept the boundaries he laid before her. And when Thomas doubled down, it set the stage for one of the most unforgettable rebuttals in modern politics. Clarence Thomas did not begin his life in marble halls or oak-paneled chambers. He was born in 1948 in Pinpoint, Georgia, a dirt-poor coastal community founded by freed slaves. His early years were defined by hardship, a father who abandoned, the family, a mother struggling to provide, and a childhood home without indoor plumbing. Poverty left its mark on him, carving out a hunger for security and respect. To escape the scarcity of his youth, Thomas clung to discipline, to order, to the idea that rising meant conforming to institutions that once excluded men like him. When he entered law, his trajectory might have signaled a champion for the marginalized. But Thomas did not take that path. Instead, his life became a paradox. The boy who had lived outside of privilege now fiercely defended the privileges of the few. His embrace of conservative politics became his armor, his entry into circles of power where loyalty to tradition was rewarded. By the time he ascended to the Supreme Court in 1991, his story had become a symbol, not of breaking barriers for others, but of breaking them for himself. His nomination was one of the most bitterly contested in modern history, shadowed by Anita Hill's explosive testimony of sexual harassment. Though he denied the allegations, the hearing for Crockett, standing across from him, was not just a debate with a colleague in government. It was a confrontation with a legacy of selective memory, where tradition was weaponized to silence progress. His words carried weight not because they were true, but because they came from someone cloaked in the authority of robes and titles. But robes and titles could not erase contradictions. They could not shield him from scrutiny forever. The audience watching knew this instinctively. They knew that beneath Thomas's invocation of tradition was fear. Fear of losing relevance. Fear of losing control. Fear that the future would belong to voices like Crockett's instead of his own. And that is what made the moment so powerful. It wasn't simply Thomas versus Crockett. It was the past versus the future, the shield of tradition against the fire of truth. But while Thomas wrapped himself in the cloak of tradition, Jasmine Crockett's story could not have been more different. Jasmine Crockett's path to the halls of power did not begin with privilege, and it certainly did not begin with a silver spoon. She was born in St. Louis, Missouri, into a working-class family that understood struggle all too well. Her upbringing was not cushioned by wealth or connections, but forged in the kind of neighborhoods where every dollar mattered and every choice carried weight. From an early age, Crockett learned that survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned. Her parents taught her the values of grit, honesty, and self-respect. They also taught her something else. The system does not always work for people like them. Too often, rules written in polished halls never touch the lives of families trying to keep the lights on or food on the table. This awareness would shape Jasmine's sense of justice long before she ever picked up a law book. In school, she, Excelled not because the path was easy, but because she refused to quit. Teachers saw in her a sharp mind and a fierce will, the kind of determination that made her unafraid to challenge authority even when it cost her popularity. That defiance wasn't born from arrogance, it was born from necessity. A refusal to shrink herself to fit into systems designed to overlook her. When she decided to pursue law, it wasn't out of some abstract dream of prestige. It was because she saw the law as both a shield and a weapon, something that could be wielded to defend the voiceless. At law school, Crockett stood out for her tenacity. She wasn't afraid to be loud, to be visible, to question professors who framed justice in terms that didn't match the realities she had lived. For some, her style was abrasive. For others, it was refreshing, proof that authenticity could exist in spaces dominated by conformity. After graduating, she didn't chase big salaries at corporate firms. Instead, she chose the unglamorous path of public defense. Day after day, she sat across from clients who had been written off by society, people who were guilty not of crimes, but of poverty. She defended them in courtrooms that cared little for their humanity, fighting case after case with limited resources and stacked odds. Those years sharpened her instincts. She learned how to dismantle weak arguments, how to command attention in rooms designed to ignore her, and how to fight fiercely without losing compassion. But Crockett was more than just a lawyer. She was a voice. Her quick wit and cutting honesty began to draw attention outside the courtroom. She spoke the language of people who had been dismissed, not with polished talking points but with raw clarity. That authenticity propelled her into politics. When she ran for office, she ran not as a polished insider, but as the same woman who had once walked into a courtroom on behalf of the powerless. Her campaign wasn't backed by deep-pocketed elites. It was powered by neighbors, activists, and everyday people who saw themselves in her. When she entered Congress, she didn't trade her authenticity for decorum. She remained unapologetically herself, fiery, unfiltered, unwilling to let tradition muzzle truth. She quickly made a name for herself, not just for her sharp cross-examinations, but for her willingness to call out hypocrisy directly. While others rehearsed sound bites, Crockett spoke from the gut, and that rawness resonated with millions. Her rise was not without challenges. Critics labeled her disrespectful, too aggressive, unprofessional. But Crockett understood the subtext. She knew that women, especially black women, were often chastised for the very traits praised in men. She refused to let those labels define her. Instead, she leaned into her sharp wit, using humor to undercut opponents, using her lived experiences to expose contradictions, and using her authenticity as a shield against the performative outrage of her detractors. Every stage of her journey, from the working-class neighborhoods of St. Louis to the sleepless nights as a public defender to the bruising battles of political campaigns, had prepared her for moments of confrontation. She carried with her the weight of clients who couldn't defend themselves, the voices of communities too often ignored, and the lessons of a family that taught her to stand tall no matter who tried to cut her down. Jasmine Crockett did not enter politics to maintain the status quo. She entered to disrupt it, to remind America that dignity is not reserved for the privileged, that truth can be spoken without apology, and that tradition should never be an excuse for injustice. And so, when Clarence Thomas accused her of disrespecting tradition, it was not just a personal attack. It was an attack on everything she represented. The audacity of a young black woman claiming her place in power without asking permission. The refusal to bow to systems that had never bowed to her. She had faced disrespect before. She had been underestimated before. But now, standing before one of the most powerful men in America, she was ready. And when Crockett finally faced Thomas, she brought every lesson, every battle, and every ounce of dignity to bear. The chamber was still heavy with the sting of Clarence Thomas's accusation, but he wasn't finished. He leaned forward now, his voice colder, firmer, each syllable landing like a hammer. Tradition is what separates order from chaos. Without it, this institution, this nation, crumbles. His words carried the weight of decades on the bench, but this time there was something else laced into them. Urgency. He repeated the word again. Tradition, as if by saying it often enough he could make it unquestionable. The repetition was a shield, a wall to keep his critics at bay. Yet the more he spoke, the more transparent his defensiveness became. Jasmine Crockett sat upright, hands folded, gaze steady. She allowed him to finish without interruption. That silence, deliberate and unbroken, unnerved him more than a murmur swept the room. The divide was visible. Some members stiffened, unwilling to challenge Thomas's authority, while others nodded almost imperceptibly, as though Crockett had just said aloud what they had long thought in silence. The tension thickened. Thomas pressed on, but his tone betrayed impatience. If every generation tramples on tradition, then nothing endures. We lose who we are. Crockett leaned back, her eyes never leaving his. Or maybe, she said softly, we finally discover who we were always meant to be. That line hung in the air, heavy and luminous. Even those who opposed her paused, caught in the force of her clarity. It was not a shout, not a scolding, but a reframing, and it struck deeper than any insult ever could. Thomas's jaw tightened. For the first time in the exchange, his composure looked fragile, his authority strained. He had expected Crockett to wilt, to bow under the weight of his words. Instead, she had met him with a quiet ferocity that exposed the cracks in his armor. The chamber grew silent again, but this time the silence was not Thomas's to command. It belonged to her. But then, with one devastating line, Crockett shifted the entire balance of power in the room. The chamber was suspended in that fragile silence, the kind that amplifies even the sound of a shuffled paper or a nervous cough. All eyes fixed on Jasmine Crockett. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though she might let the moment pass. But then she leaned forward, and the shift in her posture was electric. She was no longer simply responding. She was about to redefine the entire debate. Justice Thomas, she began, her voice clear but deliberate, you speak of tradition as if it were sacred scripture, untouched, untouchable. But tradition, sir, is not holy. It is human, and humans make mistakes. The words cut through the chamber like a blade. Some gasped softly, others stiffened in their seats. Crockett let the silence after her statement linger, forcing every ear to lean in closer. Then she continued, her cadence rising like a practiced litigator building a case. Tradition once told us slavery was acceptable. Tradition once told us women could not hold property, could not vote, could not govern their own bodies. Tradition once told us segregation was lawful, moral even. If tradition had always been right, justice, then you and I would not be standing in this room today. The line landed like a strike. A ripple of recognition swept through the chamber. Reporters raised their eyebrows. Even her critics knew she was threading history with precision, laying bare the contradictions Thomas had spent a lifetime avoiding. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried power because they were anchored in truth. She leaned back for a moment, allowing the tension to settle before pressing forward again. You see, the real story of America is not tradition for tradition's sake. It is the story of breaking tradition when it betrayed our promise of equality. Thomas shifted in his seat. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed tight. The composure he had worn like armor was cracking. Crockett pressed on. Tradition told my grandmother to sit at the back of the bus. Tradition told my mother to accept less pay for the same work. Tradition told me, when I stood in courtrooms as a public defender, that my clients were guilty before they even spoke. And tradition told every one of us who came from the margins that we should be grateful for scraps while others feasted. She paused again, letting the weight of those words settle over the chamber. The silence was thick, but not hostile. It was expectant. Every person in the room knew she was not merely speaking to Thomas. She was speaking to America itself. Her tone softened, but her conviction only sharpened. But I didn't get here by bowing to tradition. I got here because I challenged it, because I believed that justice mattered more than decorum, that dignity mattered more than hierarchy, and that truth mattered more than comfort. A murmur rippled from the gallery, the kind of restrained applause lawmakers are too disciplined to show outright but cannot suppress entirely. Crockett acknowledged it with a faint nod, then turned her gaze back to Thomas. "And here's the truth, Justice Thomas," she said, her words tightening like a noose. "Tradition without justice is oppression. Tradition without dignity is hypocrisy. And tradition without truth is nothing but a hollow excuse for power." Thomas's face hardened, but his silence spoke volumes. Crockett had seized the floor, and everyone knew it. She leaned forward once more, her voice quieter now, but more dangerous because of it. "If tradition were truly sacred, sir, then we would still live in chains. If tradition were truly perfect, then you would not be sitting on that bench, and I would not be standing here as a congresswoman. The fact that we are here at all is proof that tradition is not enough. It never was." The chamber was transfixed. Even the scribbling of pens had slowed. Every word was being absorbed, every beat of her argument carving itself into memory. Crockett delivered her final blow with the precision of someone who had been preparing her whole life. "So when you accuse me of disrespecting tradition, I will wear that accusation with pride, because my duty is not to tradition. My duty is to justice. My duty." But it wasn't just social media warriors amplifying her words. Cable news pundits, usually divided along partisan lines, marveled at her composure. On one progressive network, a commentator leaned forward and declared, "Jasmine Crockett just reminded America why we elect people who have lived the struggle. She didn't just rebut Thomas, she reframed what tradition even means." Clips replayed in slow motion, with analysis dissecting every pause, every inflection, every tightening of Thomas's jaw. Even late-night hosts couldn't resist. One opened his monologue with, "Clarence Thomas said she disrespected tradition," and Crockett said, "You're right, and that's why I'm here." The studio erupted in laughter, applause, catharsis. Meanwhile, conservative outlets scrambled to spin the narrative. They accused Crockett of being disrespectful, radical, even unhinged. But their efforts fell flat against the sheer force of virality. The clips weren't being filtered through punditry. They were spreading peer-to-peer, text-to-text, TikTok to TikTok, and every replay only reinforced the same impression. Crockett had owned the moment. Celebrities chimed in too. A Grammy-winning artist tweeted, "This is the America I believe in. Fearless, dignified, unshaken." A prominent athlete reposted her clip with the caption, "Tradition doesn't win championships. Teamwork, resilience, and truth do." Suddenly, Crockett's rebuttal wasn't just a political moment. It was a cultural one. But perhaps the most striking reactions came from ordinary people. A teacher in Georgia wrote, "My students watched Crockett's speech today. They told me they've never seen someone speak truth to power like that. They felt seen." A grandmother in Michigan commented under a viral clip, "I lived through segregation. I never thought I'd hear a young black congresswoman put it into words so powerfully. She spoke for all of us." Thomas, on the other hand, became the unwilling symbol of brittle authority. Editorial cartoons cast him as a crumbling statue labeled tradition, while Crockett was drawn holding a torch of truth, lighting the way forward. Comedians mocked his silence after her remarks, dubbing it the Thomas freeze frame. He had wielded tradition as his shield, but now it was portrayed as a relic, heavy and outdated. Crockett, meanwhile, found herself elevated overnight. Requests for interviews flooded her office. Grassroots groups hailed her as a rising star. Commentators compared her to Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, and other icons who once used the power of their voice to challenge entrenched systems. For supporters, she wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was a symbol, a vessel of vindication. And yet, amid all the noise, there was an undercurrent that ran deeper than hashtags or headlines. People weren't just celebrating a clapback. They were resonating with a truth long suppressed. The idea that dignity mattered more than ritual, that America's greatness came not from preserving old hierarchies, but from breaking them. As one viral post put it, tradition is history's echo. Justice is tomorrow's voice. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett made sure we heard the future. The digital tide was unstoppable, the applause undeniable, the memes unforgettable. Clarence Thomas had sought to discipline Crockett with a single word. Instead, she had turned that word into a national debate, and won. But beyond the memes and headlines, a deeper truth lingered, one that struck at the very heart of America. Tradition, Crockett reminded the chamber, is not sacred on its own. Without justice, tradition becomes nothing more than a ritual of control, a way to preserve the privileges of the few at the expense of the many. Her rebuttal had pierced deeper than any personal jab at Clarence Thomas. It was a mirror held up to America itself. Because what is tradition, if not the echo of choices made by those who came before us? Some traditions are noble: the fight for independence, the march for civil rights, the expansion of democracy. Others are shameful: slavery, segregation, silencing women, suppressing the vote. To invoke tradition blindly is to blur the line between what deserves reverence and what deserves rejection. Crockett's words stripped away that blur. She insisted that tradition without justice is oppression dressed up in ceremony. That real dignity cannot be inherited, demanded, or imposed. It must be earned through service, through truth, through the willingness to stand with those who have the least power. In that way, her clash with Thomas wasn't simply about political theater, it was about reclaiming the very meaning of honor. And that struck a nerve far beyond the marble walls of Washington. Viewers saw in Crockett not just a congresswoman, but an embodiment of something deeply American. The idea that authority should not be feared, but questioned. That progress comes not from preserving the old order, but from building a better one. Her confrontation became a parable, retold on news panels and in classrooms, passed around dining tables and group chats. Parents showed their children her speech, saying, "This is what it means to speak truth to power." Activists used her words to fuel rallies, painting her quotes on cardboard signs. Even those who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before now knew her as the woman who stood firm, who did not bow, who reminded a justice that justice itself mattered more than tradition. And for those who have lived their lives dismissed, ignored, or underestimated, the moment was more than symbolic. It was vindication. They could see themselves in her defiance, in her poise, in her refusal to let a title outweigh her truth. Thomas had clung to tradition as if it were armor. Crockett revealed it to be paper thin. And in doing so, she invited America to ask itself a haunting question: whose tradition are we protecting, and whose future are we sacrificing? The clash will be remembered not just because Crockett spoke boldly, but because she spoke universally. She turned a courtroom confrontation into a civic lesson, that true greatness lies not in reverence for the past, but in the courage to confront it. And as Crockett walked away from that moment, she carried more than a victory. She carried a message for all of us. Clarence Thomas may have spoken with the weight of his title, but Jasmine Crockett answered with the weight of truth. His accusation of disrespecting tradition was meant to diminish her, to reassert the old order. Instead, it backfired, revealing a hollow arrogance that could not withstand the force of clarity, dignity, and conviction. This wasn't just a clash between two figures. It was a collision between two visions of America, one that clings to power through hierarchy and fear, and another that insists respect must be earned, that tradition must bend toward justice, and that dignity belongs to every voice willing to rise. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended a principle, that progress cannot be silenced by intimidation, no matter how lofty the robe or how ancient the title. And in doing so, she reminded us all that the true strength of this country has always come from those who dared to speak when silence was safer. Now the question is, what do we do with this moment? Do we let it fade as just another headline, or do we carry it forward as a spark, a rallying cry, a reminder that arrogance crumbles when confronted with truth? If you believe dignity is stronger than arrogance, if you believe America's future should be defined by justice, not just tradition, then share this story, tell it, post it, pass it on. Because stories like this are more than debates. They're the fuel for change. And if you want to keep standing with voices like Jasmine Crockett's, subscribe now. Join this community. Together, we can amplify truth, celebrate courage, and keep this fight alive, because silence